Hello, I'm James Cridland, the radio futurologist, and every couple of weeks or so I write a newsletter all about the future of radio and what's going on with radio around the world. And this time it is all about RAJAR, MIDAS, local BBC radio and privacy. And once again, not really doing any editing, I'm just reading it out. That's all this podcast is. UK's radio audience figures, RAJAR, came out for Q3. Adam Bowie has written a good long blog taking the numbers apart and putting them in context. You'll find them linked from the show notes. Radio listening grew during the period, even though the last 2 weeks were in national mourning after the Queen's death. Hours, or TSL if you like it better that way, were up 2.5% on the quarter. Reach, or Cume if you like that, up by 1.4%. Commercial radio seems to be doing really well, posting an all-time record share of 50.9%. Last time when we spoke, I looked at how poorly BBC Sounds is faring. Now, the BBC's travails might be a blip, but it's a bit of a worrying one. What I find more interesting is RAJAR's MIDAS survey, which has also come out recently, which shows how people consume all kinds of audio content. Compiled by 1,696 people in mid-September, there again, potentially affected by the Queen's death, it's a good snapshot into how podcasting, online music services and others are doing. You should probably read MIDAS with a little caution. Notably, it's got something in it called Listen Again and Catch Up Radio, which is a peculiarly British thing. Thanks to music licensing, you can listen to most shows on demand, even music shows, and those are split out separately in MIDAS, probably thanks to music licensing. So it's not, therefore, instantly comparable to something like Edison Research's Infinite Dial UK. My hunch is, and it's a hunch, by the way, that the numbers support, suggests that the existence of Listen Again will take numbers away from podcasting, when in reality it's the same thing, delivered in almost exactly the same way, a bit of on-demand content somewhere. Now, MIDAS shows an almost complete drop-off in people who listen to digital tracks and CDs and cassettes, both down by almost 2/3 since 2016. The number of people who listen to podcasts has more than doubled in the same time. But MIDAS also measures total hours, or TSL, for each of those things too. And it's interesting to see a tremendous growth in on-demand music services like Spotify and YouTube, now responsible for 210 million hours a week in the UK. Now, the number for live radio isn't on that slide for MIDAS, because that's not what MIDAS is there for, but I'll tell you what that number is. It's just over 1 billion hours a week. So, you know, on-demand music services doing about a fifth of that. That's a pretty high number, one would have thought. Anyway, it's a great read, and I'm always grateful for the generosity of the UK radio industry for releasing it. The Guardian reported cuts to BBC local radio were coming, and they were almost right, except it's called local BBC radio now, because of course it is. The full extent of the cuts were broken by BBC News, pleasingly still calling it BBC local radio. 48 jobs will go. Well, local BBC radio is an England-only thing, if you don't know, where there are 39 local radio stations. They've until now mostly been local throughout daytime, but that is to stop, although only a bit. Now, all local radio stations will be local until 2 in the afternoon. Then, some stations will share programming with neighbouring stations, and there's more networking after 6 at night, and then they all go national after 10. Now, given my past distaste of, quotes, whatever the BBC is doing to their local radio services this week, end quotes, you're probably thinking I'm going to kick the BBC about these moves too. It seems everybody else is. I mean, you only have to read what people are saying on Twitter or on Facebook to see all kinds of venting about how dreadful the BBC is for decimating BBC local radio. But I'm afraid I see these as mostly sensible moves. To have something going out in Leeds, Sheffield and York between 2 and 6 instead of 3 separate shows, I think there's nothing wrong with that. That's called Yorkshire. That's how Yorkshire works. And I don't see that there's a particular issue with that. And indeed, listeners to local radio in many other countries will hear much the same type of thing already. ABC Local Radio here in Australia does very similar, and quite successfully too. Local breakfast shows statewide morning shows or afternoon shows, and national in the evening. So I also think CBC Radio 1 does similar as well, although the CBC has no national services, so perhaps it's not necessarily the same. But people, I think, care more about real and relevant radio than they care about where it's being broadcast from. Great radio sounds great, and if it happens to be talking about Yorkshire rather than my little bit of Yorkshire, then that seems fine. And I would much rather that than, has also been suggested, Radio 5 Live with local news opt-outs. That wouldn't be a good thing for BBC local BBC radio at all. What is a little odd, though, is the groupings. So as one example, and I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit here, Leeds, Sheffield and York will share 2 till 6, and Humberside and Lincolnshire will also share their programming. Then after 6 p.m, Leeds, Sheffield, York and Humberside join together, and Lincolnshire doesn't join Humberside, no, it joins with Derby, Nottingham and Leicester, which seems a little bit odd. So if you're listening to BBC Radio in Humberside, then after 6, the presenter is going to have to promote what you'll be able to listen in Yorkshire and in the Midlands, which is a bit weird. And the person in charge of BBC Radio Humberside, get this, will also be in charge of BBC Radio York. That kind of makes sense. And they will be in the region of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. And the region of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire does not include BBC Radio Lincolnshire. Genius. That will share programming between 2 and 6, but not between 6 and 10. And somebody else will be in charge of that. BBC Radio Lincolnshire isn't in the region of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, but it's actually in the region of the Midlands. It's all a little bit messy, it has to be said. Now, it is, of course, a shame that 48 people will be impacted, but the majority of radio listening does happen before 2 in the afternoon. Listeners there won't notice anything. It'll just be as local as it was before. So I don't personally think it's the end of the world, as many people do, but perhaps after decades of BBC local radio getting the rough end of the stick, that's what management wants us to think. Now, over on Pod News, I wrote about Rover. It's an app from New Zealand broadcaster MediaWorks, and it was spraying private location information to any podcast publisher that was on the service, clearly against New Zealand privacy laws. I even got details of what could have been a MediaWorks employee in Palmerston North, another New Zealander in Christchurch. Now, I worked on that article for 3 days. You'll find it linked in the show notes. I thought that it was quite a sensational privacy story that would be picked up by the trades, and as ever, I was wrong. But it does beg the question, if you're collecting all of that data, be really careful who you share it with. And a random podcast publisher in another country is probably not a good person to be sharing any data with, particularly the location information of individual people who are using your app. That's a bad thing. Other news in brief, they may have won a place in the Australian Radio Hall of Fame, but Kyle and Jackie O are distrusted so much by the radio station they work for that there's a 30-second delay and an aggressive swear beep, and there's some audio that I link to today so that you can go and have a listen to what went out on the air. Now, I mean, it may well be a stunt. Who knows? It probably is a stunt, but it sounds very strange. Also, at last, a regular transmission using the DRM standard. You remember that DRM, or you may not remember. Frankly, I wouldn't blame you for not remembering. But DRM is a method of broadcasting on AM and shortwave. It sounds pretty good. It's great technology, but virtually nobody's using it, and there are virtually no radio receivers out there, with the exception of India, where there are a few people using it, and there are a few radio sets available, but none that a typical Indian person can buy, to be frank. But anyway, there is now a new regular transmission using the DRM standard. It's from North Korea. Excellent. We'll be tuned in then to that then, won't we? Or maybe not. Capital in the UK has a new logo. They've dropped the FM frequencies completely that they listed on it. And you only have to look at the MIDAS survey above, the MIDAS survey that I talked about earlier, for why. If you're considering doing that, by the way, in other countries, yeah, I would just, I'd be cautious. I think you pull frequencies off your logos and off your radio station when you have a lot, and I mean a lot, of people not using analog anymore. If you've still got more than 50% of your listeners using, even 33% of your listeners using using the analog platforms, I still think that you should be telling people what frequency you're on, personally, but that's just me. I linked to an amazing slide from Fred Jacobs' tech survey, which let me click through while I read this out and tell you what that amazing slide says. Oh yes, that's right. In a first, it says Bluetooth overtakes FM radio as the most important feature among new car buyers. Now, this is research that's done with core radio listeners, so people who are on the VIP list for a radio station or that sort of thing. So they're people that really like their radio and really enjoy it, and they fill out the tech survey every single year. And this is the first year that Bluetooth is the most important feature inside a car. 76% of respondents said that. 70% said FM radio is really important. Just 33% said AM radio is very important, which is just as well, because Ford has actually pulled AM radio out of their new trucks in the US, because they're electric trucks and they will make whining noises. So that's a thing. The stats skew much older than the population, but it's quite a thing. In the UK, the Radio Centre's CEO Matt Payton has been interviewed. It's a good interview, worth reading. Amazon's AMP has fired half its workforce as a cost-cutting measure. What's AMP? Well, it's a radio service. It's hosted by the likes of you and me, except not me, because it's only available in the US, and still, more than 6 months after launch, still only available on Apple iPhones, not, proper phones. It had 300 people working on it. It's now only got 150. What on earth do all these people do? It's just a live radio service. You can, all you need is a stream. It's not really the world's most complicated thing. Anyway, that's gone, or half of it's gone. Who knows what's going on there? Richard Waghorn has posted a really nice visual radio studio at Irish broadcaster RTE. I remember Richard when he was working in BBC television. And it fascinates me that the BBC has yet to have a single studio really dressed up, looking nice for video use, as far as I'm aware. All of their radio studios look very radio, and I think that was a mistake that they made when they moved into the new broadcasting house, and it's a mistake that they weirdly continue doing to this day. Certainly when you watch people like Greg James doing the Radio 1 Breakfast Show, he's kind of hidden behind a microphone. You can't even really see his face, so it's all a bit of a mess. And in Australia, another radio brand is no longer a radio brand. SBS Radio is rebranding to SBS Audio from next year. SBS is the public service broadcaster for people that don't speak English in predominantly. That's what they do. They've got a number of different radio services. I'd love to tell you how good they are in terms of audience figures, but they don't appear to take part in those audience figures. However, one of the nice things about SBS is that SBS Radio 3, which is on DAB here in the cap cities in Australia, is a 24-hour feed of the BBC World Service, and it's in stereo, and it sounds really quite lovely. The only slightly weird thing about it, actually, is that if you're listening to the SBS version of the BBC World Service, then, for reasons best known to the SBS, they take the African breakfast show. So at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, all of a sudden you're hearing some very bright and jolly African people saying good morning, and let's have a look at a bright new day. Which is very strange. Anyway, thank you to Richard Hilton, to James Masterton, and to Brun Audio Consulting for your ongoing support of this newsletter. I'm very grateful to you. If you'd like to support my work in any way, you can buy me a coffee, or if you're Rupert Brun, buy me a sausage roll. Be a member to give regularly, or just give a one-off coffee or 5. It's buymeacoffee.com/James Cridland. My professional website has more detail. My professional website has more details about who I am and what I do. and indeed whether or not I can help you further. But that's it for this time around. So until we meet again, keep listening.